The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hi, I'm Matt Lepore, and this is About Litchfield, and I'm being joined by Dianne Plansky, who is our local weather personality from the Litchfield What's Up page.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Absolutely. Today we're going to be talking about a unique storm that came to Litchfield in southern New Hampshire. I coined it the Apple Storm of 1965. So, on August 28th, 1965, we had a very unique storm that came to town, and it brought a tornado, and it also brought large hail to the region that destroyed a lot of apple crops. So a little bit of background. So there's been quite a few tornadoes in New Hampshire. You wouldn't think so because of New Hampshire's landscape and the biome, but it's actually more common than people think. Between 1950 and 2017, there have been 100 tornadoes to sweep across New Hampshire.
That's a lot. I didn't even know that we were getting that many of them.
I didn't either. It's very interesting. Many of them happen in secluded areas like Pittsburgh, New Hampshire has had quite a few. They had one last year, and they've had a couple over the years. And they've just landed right in the middle of secluded areas and taken down trees, and people have been rather surprised. They never expected to see them.
Yep.
So these 100 tornadoes have actually caused quite a bit of destruction. 1 fatality, 30 injuries, and approximately $12.6 million in property damage.
Wow.
There was the most significant of these tornadoes was one in July of 2008 that went 50 miles. It caused that 1 fatality, and it contributed to 5 of those injuries, I believe. So it was very significant.
Yeah.
The most significant decade for tornadic activity is in the 1960s. Roughly a third of the tornadoes occurred then, 31 to be exact.
2008 storm, I just heard from a very interesting source that the woman who died was actually trying to protect her grandchild from the tornado spout, the winds and everything, and that there was just tremendous damage from that. So, I mean, they're really still out there, and we just don't hear about them. You hear about them in the plains and things, but... So, let's see here. The thunderstorm brought heavy rain, damaging hail, a funnel cloud, and a tornado. Much of the damage was focused between Wilton and Durham. The worst portion of the storm lasted between 5 and 6 p.m.
Yes, what's interesting about this storm is that it had the tornado, but a funnel cloud is a tornado that just hasn't touched the ground. So you can look at the storm as producing two very unique conditions where such activity can happen, and it's in one storm to produce one tornado and what could have been a tornado is even more rare. It just shows how significant the storm really was.
Well, and if it came up the Merrimack, then it would have been a water spout.
We
could have actually had a water spout from that as well.
Yes, and if that funnel cloud touched down in where it was over the Great Bay, that would have been a water spout as well.
Yeah.
So for a timeline, this storm really began towards late afternoon, early evening. So by 5:10, the storm starts to move into Wilton, which is the western side of where this activity occurred. So we had strong wind and hail of up to 1 inch move through Wilton and Milford, which are adjacent towns. Wilton is to the west and Milford is to the right. Both caused significant damage. There were about 40 trees that were uprooted, and utility failures resulted. And the windows and aluminum frames were damaged by hail, so that just shows how strong and significant the conditions were with that.
Back in 1965, we didn't have the weather broadcasting that we do now either, the forecasting. So I imagine that a lot of this hit quickly. People didn't know it was coming, and nobody knew it was coming towards them. Most likely. The way now, if these things happen, we're kind of like, okay, oh my gosh, it's on this street, and everybody knows, just the same way on the What's Up page, that very quickly as things happen around town, they go, but back then, nobody knew. It was just, hello, here we are.
Yeah, we're fortunate now because we can predict storms like that, both in the United States and in Europe. They were able to accurately predict the winter storm that we got the other day, and it allowed us to prepare for it, so that we could be ready for it.
Yep.
So here's the map of southern New Hampshire. Here is where Wilton is. I don't know if my mouth shows up.
Well,
I don't know if it does.
if it's there, it's there. I just
Okay.
can't see it.
So here's Wilton. If you look to, it's towards bottom center, left of center a little bit, and to the east is Milford. And you can generally see along there's a track here, a west to east track where it goes over to Litchfield, Londonderry, Derry, the affected areas. It's kind of like a straight line you can see it going through. So there's definitely a northeasterly pattern to it. So it reaches over to the Derry and Londonderry area, which also saw significant damage, very similar to what we saw in Wilton and Milford. Multiple trees were knocked over and utility failures were pretty widespread. 2 houses suffered damage as a result from the falling trees. And the interesting thing of where I came up with a name for the storm is that thousands of bushels of apples were destroyed by the hail from this storm. And the figures for that damage were between $5,000 and $50,000. So the weather report, they categorize damage, both crop and property damage, and they have a category for it, and it was under category number 4, which is $5,000 to $50,000 in damage.
Back in 1965, which comparably would be what in
Significantly
2018?
greater,
Significantly greater.
And it was widespread because also the crop damage in apple orchards was in Wilton and Milford, so that accumulated when you get their orchards and the orchards on the eastern side of the Merrimack River, the damage is very significant.
And I imagine that damage continued for years while the trees recovered from that too.
I bet.
And the winter storm that we had, where we had so much snow back in like October, or there was like a Halloween storm, and the trees I have trees that are still recovering from that damage, so I can imagine how many years it took for those apple trees to come back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it must have taken some time to repair. Nobody seemed to have been around at the time. I reached out to a couple orchards, and it was before their time, and they paused when I asked them about this event 53 years ago, and almost 53 years ago, and so it was.
Oh, Mr. Wilson was probably around on his tractor.
Yeah, I bet they might have suffered some damage. So moving further east, the storm moved into Lee, where the wind contributed to a lot of damage that happened there, again with falling trees. And in Lee, a tree blew over onto a police car and smashed it, caused some significant damage. It landed on the trunk, or like the rear section of the car, and I contacted the Lee Police Department, and they were actually able to contact the police chief at the time, and he said it was a 1964 Ford Galaxy, and unfortunately it was actually a privately owned vehicle. It wasn't a town vehicle, so the officer was using a private vehicle, and it got destroyed under this
Hopefully
tree.
it wasn't his mother's car.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
No.
One-year-old car.
Yeah, it's a brand new one.
Yeah.
Ooh, probably cost like $1,500 or something.
It looked like a nice car. I looked it up, and it was a large car too, so it must have been pretty expensive to replace that. And then it moved further east over to Durham and UNH, and from here you could see the damage from the wind in the form of trees blown over and a lot of like branches and debris tossed around on the campus.
So about how long did it hit each of those spots? How fast did it go through that?
That's an interesting question. So if it took about 50 minutes, say, to get, it got from 5:10 is where it started in Milton. I always confuse Wilton. Sorry, I keep confusing the names Wilton and Milford. And so it made its way to Litchfield by 5:30. So in 20 minutes, it was able to travel across 3 towns over. And then, so it was moving relatively quickly for it to be able to cover that amount of distance, I'd say. So then we get to the tornado that came up to Litchfield. So about 5:30, 20 minutes after the storm hit Wilton, a tornado was seen crossing the Merrimack River and heading east. So this was a waterspout for a time. It did go over the river. And it's pretty interesting to see that it's a common myth that tornadoes can't really move across water and uneven
they move
surfaces.
fast.
They can. They can. It
really
has
fast
happened.
across water.
And there was one recently in 2016, I believe, where there was a waterspout that touched down on Lake Winnipesaukee, and somebody witnessed it, and there was footage of it. and I believe it was on WMUR.
That'd be cool till it started coming towards you.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to get too close to one. So as it crossed the Merrimack River from west to east, it was at the Hudson-Litchfield line, it crossed roughly in the area of where the Litchfield border with Hudson is, where on 3A, where Pat Jewett had the new sign put in, roughly in that area. And along the way, it uprooted trees and some crops that were out there at the time. And this tornado was a Category F1, so it's the second category in. And those tornadoes have some pretty strong winds, 73 to 112 miles per hour. They're pretty strong. They can rip shingles off the roof of a house. They can actually significantly damage a roof, and they can push cars. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
It's pretty low in terms of the Fujita scale, the F1. And it was relatively short-lived. So it made it from the Merrimack River, and it ended west of Robinson Pond, off of the intersection between Page Road and.
So it really kind of barely just touched Litchfield and then went to Hudson, came up the Merrimack through Litchfield.
Yes, well, it's uncertain precisely where it was, but if it wasn't in Litchfield, it was extremely close. This is the closest we've ever been to having one. Yeah. There were two other tornadoes that we've had that kind of crossed from a northwest to a southeast pattern. Both of them ended up in like south of the Manchester airport, like North Londonderry and West Londonderry, so very close to Litchfield as well. But this one definitely came the closest if it didn't touch Litchfield.
It sounds like it just we kind of breezed in, luckily.
So it's according to the NOAA, it said it only touched down for 0.3 of a mile, although it kind of contradicts itself because there was also the information saying that people witnessed it cross the Merrimack River. So the exact distance I would say, was between the 0.3 that they gave, and I also measured between the Merrimack River, saying that it started there and went over to its ending spot, and that was roughly 2.3 miles, I want to say, somewhere around there. It was about 40 yards wide, which is within the swath that F1 tornadoes usually have. Yeah. So that was based on the damage area, and I bet they could calculate that through pretty easily by seeing the amount of trees and crops that were uprooted. So here's a map that I got from the National Weather Service of the NOAA records, and the red dot that you see kind of on the right, towards the right side of the screen, that is the last point where it is known to have been seen, kind of like the ending point.
So it kind of died, but right before Robinson Pond.
Mm-hmm. Usually they provide like a beginning and end point, but it was vague. They didn't really have enough records to determine where.
Well, that's still a pretty woody area now, so it must have been even more woody then.
Yeah.
And there's millions of trails back there in Hudson back there too.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, roughly in a west to east direction, but the area it could have come from or could have touched down on is relatively wide. Definitely room for it to have come into Litchfield, or at least extremely close, because it's pretty close right there. Here's Page Road and 102 intersecting right here. So up in this corner is where we have the I can't remember what's there. It's the there's a t-shirt printing store, I believe. So it's a pretty familiar location, and it's pretty close nearby.
The storm caused widespread power outages and damage. Numerous trees were toppled, some onto homes and vehicles. Crop damage was between 5,000 and 50,000. Is that in addition?
Oh, sorry, that was just recapping, kind of
that's
going
a recap.
over the damage.
Okay. So it was pretty substantial.
Yeah, and property damage was roughly the same, although I got a narrower estimate of more like $25,000 in terms of property damage, such as what happened to the Ford Galaxy that was used by the Lee police.
Yeah.
And the houses that were damaged, and utility damage as well.
I'm sure a lot of people didn't report their damage as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that was really interesting, Matt. What's your next thing going to be? What are you going to do next?
So next, I want to do something about town government. I would like to look at the Heritage Commission, because they're brand new, and I'd really like to see when they get new members, why they got involved, and what what their goals are for this new branch of
Yeah,
government.
I think we all want to know what's going on with that. That sounds like a really interesting, because I mean, we have this big discussion about whether or not we demo the fire department, but that building itself has so much history to it that I'm sure that it needs to be explored and thought what else could be done with it, maybe, because that did not pass. That was one of the things that did not pass. Thanks. Me too. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
I
for
learned a
coming
lot
on.
about tornadoes.
Thank you.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.